With the largest ever land forces, sea and air armadas, and even missile forces put together at any place at any time in all of human history, the largest ever invasion utilizing the brand new fourth generation warfare doctrines were now underway, wherein high technology was blended together with external invasion forces crossing borders as well as conducting coastal landings to be the heavy handed reinforcements of the Trojan shock armies, who were the key movers of the entire war doctrine, as these Trojan shock armies materialized from within the nation as they had initially begun on CCP regime properties that were strategically purchased exceptionally close to their given objectives, whereupon the hostilities initiating would see very many Trojan shock components emerging from these properties to go for the nation's proverbial jugular. As the key nodes along major invasion routes, which effectively consisted of major and medium, and even in some cases small cities, also contained a number of given objectives of their own. The Trojan shock forces would obtain total and complete control of these nodes to allow for the smooth movement of the external invasion forces deep inland before these would fan out to assist the Trojan shock armies further inland as their heavy reinforcements, as the Trojan units controlling key nodes throughout the major invasion routes ensured that the external components would not, in their massively long miles in length convoys, have to stop and leave these invasion routes to engage enemy forces, which would take an immense amount of time, especially in a nation as vast as the United States of America, as it was incumbent upon the Trojan shock armies to rapidly obtain complete and total control of the key invasion routes to ensure the smooth transition through their areas of operations of these enormous invasion prongs of the external components coming from outside of the nation, from both Mexico in the south and Canada in the north. As it pertained to the South Central invasion sector, a sector of the nation that was extremely important not only to the nation's economic vitality, but also to its military viability, as the operations now occurring along the coast of the South Central invasion sector involved a massive campaign in the nation's fourth largest city, which was the city of Houston, as nearby to the slight northeast was the Beaumont and Port Arthur area, which, although lacking any Trojan shock army components, contained a number of operatives of the coalition forces intelligence agencies, namely from China, Iran, and Pakistan, as the Chinese MSS, Pakistani ISI, and Iranian Ministry of Intel all had operatives sowing chaos in this area, as they had effectively clipped the fences while wearing U.S. Army fatigues with the correct unit patches, having it snuck into critical military logistical facilities and conducted massive sabotage on the motor pools and even certain key administrative buildings, as this was to help prepare the battlefield for the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade's landings, as the 1st PLAN Marine Brigade was conducting its landings to support the operations going on in Houston. The 6th was tasked with capturing this critically important military logistical facility known as the Port of Beaumont, as there were major rail lines, and this was also a major road junction that included a critical invasion route, which was I-10, passing through this area. This was the literal gateway to the American Southeast, as the southeastern invasion sector would be aided by the arrival of group armies 15 through 20, although the 15th Group Army would be shed off in Houston to relieve the 83rd to continue north and east into the Texarkana region. The remaining group armies would continue to press into the American Southeast, and control of the Beaumont and Port Arthur battle space was of critical importance. Although the forces tasked with seizing this area were relatively small in comparison to the operations occurring nearby in Houston, the 8,500 strong 6th PLAN Marine Brigade was definitely up to the task, as they would be heavily supported by naval missile fire, as well as also a sizable air armada allocated to this area, namely a Russian Su-34 strike aircraft squadron and 2 J-10 fighter squadrons, as the combination of the 4 Type 055 Renhai class guided missile cruisers and the J-10 fighter squadrons provided a total air defense cover, along with the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade's own SHORAD battalion. The airspace over the battle space would be in full control of the coalition as the operation was set to begin. As the Renhai class cruisers were highly advanced weapons of war and had electronic warfare capabilities in addition to the Dragon Eye system, which enabled them to engage and track multiple targets through multiple domains, land, sea, and air, and effectively strike all these different targets virtually simultaneously, as each Renhai class vessel had 112 VLS cells. They could carry each 112 different missiles, whether they were anti-ship, air defense, or land attack cruise missiles, even anti-submarine missiles as well, to boot. Although the majority of the missiles aboard the Type 055 vessels would be HHQ-9 air defense missiles, as well as also YJ-21 anti-ship missiles, CJ-10 long-range subsonic land attack cruise missiles, and the supersonic YJ-18A land attack cruise missiles. The resupply ship in the area, namely the Type 903 resupply vessel, was a complete resupply ship that could not only refuel the naval vessels at sea, but also resupply them with ammunition and other logistical needs. The 4 submarines in the Gulf included the 4 Yuan class Type 039A submarines, which also would launch land attack cruise missile strikes with YJ-18B cruise missiles to support the operations both in Houston and in the Beaumont area, as the 8 total combat vessels had to divide their attention between both battle spaces. They still possessed enough firepower to do so, and relatively adequately, as the air power would also play a key role in this operation. Not only were there the 3 combat aircraft squadron, the 2 J-10 squadrons, and 1 Su-34 squadron, but also the PLAN provided an electronic warfare support aircraft, a Y-9LG, which doubled as an electronic warfare and ELINT aircraft, which was electronic intelligence, as well as also the Russian VVS providing one of their IL-78 refueling aircraft to support the 3 combat aircraft squadrons operating in the battle space to keep them in the air for as lengthy a time as possible. As the fighters and Renhai class vessels off the coast would rapidly gain air superiority, as there were effectively no air threats in this area, the aircraft of the J-10 squadrons would, upon doing an RTB a bit later in the operation, begin to return armed with more and more air-to-ground munitions to support the ever-expanding ground operations. Initially kicking off the invasion in this area was a massive anti-shipping strike conducted by the 4 Type 055 Renhai-class vessels, firing their YJ-21 anti-ship missiles, hypersonic, And these would destroy the Coast Guard cutters and one U.S. naval combat ship, a littoral combat ship, operating in this area. As the littoral combat ship, the USNS Indianapolis would be struck by 3 YJ-21 hypersonic anti-ship missiles and 1 USUN underwater loitering munition, as this was the first of its kind, as there had been surface-based loitering munitions. This could submerge and assault submarines and surface vessels alike, and was a highly advanced weapon of war. And the Coast Guard cutters would likewise be struck by USUNs and anti-ship missiles. There would also be the use of HHQ-9 air defense missiles to effectively destroy the 2 MH-60R anti-submarine warfare helicopters being utilized from the rear deck of the Indianapolis, as well as a Dolphin helicopter from one of the Coast Guard cutters in the area. As in this particular area, besides the USNS Indianapolis, there was also a Protector-class Coast Guard cutter, 2 Sentinel-class Coast Guard cutters, 1 Heritage-class Coast Guard cutter, and, of course, the supporting vessels belonging to the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command, consisting of the 3 Lewis and Clark naval supply ships, the 3 General Frank S. Besson-class Army transport ships, and the 1 fleet oiler of the U.S. Navy operating in this area, the USNS Kanawha. All of these vessels would be sunk near instantaneously as soon as hostilities had initiated, as the first units from the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade would be its 2 lightest units, its Reconnaissance Battalion and its Air Assault Battalion, conducting their landings to initially seize control of vital areas in the battle space. The Reconnaissance Battalion, upon landing on the northern shores of the Sabine Lake, would capture a marine services facility that had docking facilities adequate enough to accommodate the incoming cargo ships carrying the different battalions of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, as the medium combined arms battalion and light combined arms battalion would be landed in this secured facility. As a very short-lived battle would be fought in this area, as there were actual locals in these hinterlands outside of the Port Arthur area that were relatively well-armed and equipped militia-type forces that, upon hearing all the enormous missile strikes, not only occurring nearby at sea, but also inland, would race into the area to try to conduct a sort of reconnaissance of their own, only to make contact with the reconnaissance battalions comprising companies and effectively be destroyed by a combination of their firepower and strikes from a single Su-34 strike aircraft from the Su-34 squadron. As each Su-34 was a very powerful aircraft and could carry 26,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, with their SVP-24 computerized bombing sight could make unguided munitions nearly as accurate as laser-guided precision munitions. But there was also the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which made unguided strikes exceedingly accurate as well for both the PLAAF and Russian VVS. As the Combat Engineer Battalion would likewise send a force ashore from its cargo ship containing its battalion's comprising components. 1 company aboard motor rafts would race ashore in Port Arthur and rapidly secure the port facilities without having had fired a shot immediately, as it would take some time for other defending forces, whether the armed civilian components or the military components, to fully realize the extent of what was going on all throughout this area, as this 45-mile by 30-mile battle space, 45 east-west, 30 north-south, was a sizable battle space, and landings would be conducted in two different areas, in Port Arthur's port and the north shore of the Sabine Lake, as the reconnaissance battalion would quickly move to clear flanks before racing towards the Vidor area to control the I-10 crossing out of Beaumont from its east-facing direction. This would help pen in the military forces who, in the total throes of the chaos of the sabotage and the soon incoming tactical ballistic missile strikes from the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade of the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, a Trojan unit that had been embedded in eastern Texas, firing 4 each of DF-11As and DF-15Bs at critical building targets in the Beaumont port area in the military logistical sites. So again, this was a critical military logistical area, and great effort would be taken to spare the important logistical components, as these would be utilized later in the Chinese colonial efforts to take place, as the occupation of this land would greatly benefit from facilities such as this, as foreign deployments of heavy units from Fort Hood and other installations were made from this port. The PLAN Marines would try to capture much of it intact, apart from certain buildings, and of course destroying motor pool facilities with the vehicles therein. And the units that were effectively arrayed in this particular area of the 842nd Transportation Battalion, the 596th Transport Group, U.S. Military Sea Lift Command, and the 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion in the reserve site installation that was further into the downtown area, as the general PLAN plan effectively called for the landings to occur on the North Shore to rapidly seize control of the Entergy Sabine power plant that was guarded by a small contingent of 300 American paramilitary forces mobilized and sent to the area from the DHS, who were lightly equipped and issued crew-served weapons for their Max Pro MRAPs that had been handed down to them through government programs. They would seize control of this vital segment of I-10 through Orange, which again was the literal gateway into the American Southeast, as right across the river from Orange was the state of Louisiana. And this would be seized along with the Entergy power plant by the Light Combined Arms Battalion, while the Medium Combined Arms Battalion would seize control of Vidor and a sizable segment of I-10, while the Reconnaissance Battalion would seize control of the I-10 crossing into and out of Beaumont in the Vidor area, allowing with the landings of air assault battalions at key bridges that would remain intact for later use by the occupation forces, both the I-10 bridge for the external components to move through this key node, and the 96 highway bridge to the north of the city, which would be the northern entry and exit point to Beaumont. These areas would be totally seized, while all other street bridges that cross the many canals and rivers in this area would be hit with cruise missile strikes coming from the sea, as well as also from container-based systems 2 hours in, as YJ-18Cs and Club Ks would also begin to fire throughout the country, and this area would be no exception, as this would be of vital assistance to the ongoing operations carried out by the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade's forces. As the initial movements, besides the landings of the Reconnaissance Battalion and the initial capture of the Port Arthur port by a single company from the Combat Engineer Battalion and rubber motor rafts, the Transportation Aviation Battalion, consisting of the high-capacity Z-18 transport and utility helicopters, would be flying in 3 of 5 ground-based companies of the Air Assault Battalion to the north, and would effectively move in a horseshoe pattern around the city to avoid all of the missile strikes that were incoming from the sea, as they would do a second return trip in the same pattern to then drop off the 2 remaining air assault infantry companies, as the first 2, with the mortar company of the battalion, be dropped off in the north to control the Highway 96 crossing, and the last 2 to control the Interstate 10 crossing across the river into the southwest of the city of Beaumont. As The follow-up flights would include the return of the Transport Aviation Company of the Air Assault Battalion, flying in copious amounts of mortars and ammunition for the three companies in the north, and also flying in ammunition for the two companies in the south, as they would also be carrying out medevac operations as clashes with the U.S. Marine Corps, as their first, the 123rd Battalion, had two of its companies in the area, as this was a local reserve unit, as this battalion was part of the 4th Marine Division. These two companies, Alpha Company, which was a rifle company, and the Weapons Company, were interspersed together throughout this area to mutually support one another, as they had been effectively bivouacked and placed on large plots of land that had been effectively requisitioned for their use by the state and federal regimes, with the landowners being compensated handsomely, as these areas would be relatively defaced by the Marines digging in all throughout these areas, and also creating berms around their headquarters section sites, as each company had a headquarters section, and the different platoons of both companies would be interspersed all throughout the area, as these forces were put in place effectively to act as a type of reinforcement for the logistical forces in the city. This was the best location that the state and federal regimes could pick to effectively bivouac them on, and therefore, as intelligence had been gathered prior to the invasion, the coalition had come up with the battle plan of removing most of the bridges, except for a small handful that would be effectively captured and controlled by them, of the 6th Marine Brigade, that is, as the ISR grip in this battle space, like all the other battle spaces, would effectively be an iron grip, as there would be high-altitude drones that would fly from CCP regime properties in the Houston battle space into this area to provide the high-altitude layer of reconnaissance capabilities. The quadcopter assets at the squad and vehicle crew level of the PLAN Marines would provide, of course, the low-altitude real-time mapping along with the high-altitude drones and satellites, and this area would be on complete ISR lockdown with these capabilities, as electronic warfare jamming of redundant radio and portable radar systems would be provided, at least in this area, by a PLAN Y9LG EW/ELINT aircraft, as well as also further out at sea with the Type 055s having EW capabilities that blanketed a sizable portion of this battle space, as they would eventually sail in closer as they eliminated coastal threats. The electronic warfare would ensure that the American ability to communicate would effectively be thrown back into the Stone Age, and the ability to coordinate would be extremely difficult. Nonetheless, out of all the forces present, the Marines, being combat troops, even though they were reserves, they still would put up the best possible fight they could, as they were the best armed and equipped out of all the forces on the literal and figurative map, as the logistical forces would likewise put up the best possible fight they could. They would be exceedingly hampered by the availability of anti-armor weaponry, as they would only be equipped with their crew serve weapons and small arms. And they, despite this, would still try to put up the best fight possible, but these were effectively non-combat, logistical-oriented troops, and they were to be swept aside by the Combat Engineer Battalion and Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, which would be the first two battalions to be landed in Port Arthur, as they would sweep in the general north towards the city to seize control of this vital node containing I-10, as well as the port facilities, and eventually the airports in the area would be captured as well, as there were three main airports that the PLAN was effectively eyeballing, so to speak, for their future forward operating bases: the airport in Orange, the airport in Port Arthur, and the airport in Beaumont, as these would be suitable for smaller units to effectively turn into forward operating base facilities. As the clock had struck midnight, the strikes on all the shipping was instantaneous, as the aircraft were already in the air and approaching American airspace before the strike of midnight. They had arrived on scene immediately. As immediately following the missile strikes, the Air Assault Battalion and its first three land-based companies and the Transport Aviation Company were already en route to disembark these three companies in the north of the city before the Z-18s of the Transport Aviation Company would return to pick up the other two air assault infantry companies and drop them off. The 82 millimeter mortar company, effectively the 82 millimeter mortar company would be the troops only in naval fatigues with 82 millimeter mortar systems, would be dropped with the first two air assault infantry companies and backed up to the hilt by the Combat Aviation Company with its two flying platoons of 5 Z-9WA gunships each, as there were also three Z-9Cs, which were anti-submarine warfare, that would remain aboard the Type 075 landing dock or assault ship, which was like a helicopter aircraft carrier. They would not be used as there were no submarine threats in the area. However, the size of the Combat Aviation Company in the PLAN Marine 6th Brigade's Air Assault Battalion was slightly larger than many of the PLA Ground Forces or Army's Air Assault Battalion's Combat Aviation Companies, as each flying platoon had 5 gunships instead of 4, and this would aid in the ability to press more of their firepower advantage onto ground forces below them. As the forces landed in this area, a nearly 3-hour-long battle would ensue, as within the first hour, the securing of the landing zone, as well as repelling attacks from armed reactionary civilians into the area, would effectively last in order for there to be a full perimeter to secure the landing zone and bridge area, which would then lead to a reconnaissance in force against the Marines, as well as heavy airstrikes by 2 out of the 12 Su-34s of the squadron, expending all of their munitions on the Marine bivouac site, as it was a large area and the Marines were very well spread out and even well dug in. It would take these two aircraft utilizing all of their air-to-ground munitions to effectively wipe out the vast majority of the two companies due to their spread out and dug-in nature, as the gunships of the PLAN Marine Air Assault Battalion would also play a large role, as they would fire a sizable number of ATGM's 23 millimeter cannon fire, but saving their 70 millimeter rocket pods, as some of these aircraft carried those for emergency situations. Enormous quantities of ammunition would be expended between both the helicopter platforms of the gunships and the Su-34 aircraft, but also joining all of this firepower would be the PLAN Marines 82 millimeter mortar fire to support their troops once the resupply operation was underway to drop off mortars and ammunition to this landing zone. As we go to the map of the landing zone area, this effectively sat in an area that straddled wetlands to the north and east, as this was the Big Thicket National Preserve area, as this was the access roads on the highway, the state highway entry and exit ramps, and this was the tributary that marked the northern boundary of the city limits, of the city proper. Of course, there were businesses along the highway and access road, and houses and even farms and ranches to the north of the city, including this shooting range, this firing range, which, as the gunships of the two flying platoons of the Combat Aviation Company flown in, they fired immense quantities of 23 millimeter high explosive anti-armor rounds at these small grouping of armed civilians and their vehicles in this parking lot, destroying them as they cleared the area. The other three gunships fanned out facing to the north, while these cleared this neighborhood within the city limits, which was a somewhat suburbanized neighborhood, and fired 23 millimeter cannon fire at groupings of armed civilians now emerging from many of these homes and beginning to cluster together to try to figure out what was going on, only to be lit up by the heavy firepower from 23 millimeter cannons. Even a small number of ATGMs would be fired at vehicle-based targets, as HJ-08s had been fired off-map to hit a few technicals with armed personnel inside. As a definition of a technical is essentially a pickup truck or SUV with armed personnel, and these would be destroyed. Cruise missiles, of course, were being fired at this time, going off map to hit bridges as the river veered north and wound through the area as this road crossed the river where it wound north and would hit that bridge as this YJ-18A was en route to destroy it, as separating this map was 1 mile of terrain between this map and this map to the northwest, as the Marine bivouac site was also in this area, and beyond, as a kilometer separated this map from this map, where the Marines of their weapons company's mortar platoon had dug mortar pits and bunkers into this area, as the bunkers were underground. Here, behind the mortar pits, as these circles are the entryways, they had dug trench systems connecting these, covered them with pallets, and covered the pallets with dirt, making these effectively tunnels through this area. This was the platoon headquarters, the FTC personnel, and the forward observers who were out from this element and forward deployed in a wooded area would, after having the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and electronic warfare, having completely removed all American ISR and communications capabilities, effectively have to do gunnery the old way by having the forward observers find the rough positions on the map of where the PLA forces were, roughly, and using the map work and calculations on paper to roughly figure out where to fire their 81 millimeter mortars at in terms of hitting PLA forces, although these would be quickly suppressed as soon as they would begin firing in earnest, as airstrikes with the remaining munitions aboard the two allocated Su-34 aircraft, as well as also cruise missile strikes from 2 of the 4 submarines, the Yuan class, the Type 039As, firing YJ-18Bs at these mortar pits, each individual one being targeted for a cruise missile strike, as well as the airstrikes, would silence these personnel and their weapons forever. At the time of the landings, within the first hour, as by 12:15, all companies would be landed. 30 minutes later, ISR assets, and using the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as the high-altitude assets had discovered movement as armed civilians were clustering together in the wilderness areas of the wetlands like marshes and swamps, as well as woods and fields that were located in this area, and moving towards the LZ, as they had realized helicopters were coming to the area as they heard the noise, and they tried to investigate, as a grouping of 200 of them split into 3 groups of 2 prongs of 80 and 1 of 40, as the first company to land would effectively move into a curvature formation in the prone position and would hold their positions against these attacks from this grouping of 200 armed civilians moving into the area. And they would hold their position, again, 30 minutes into the operation, by which point the Z-18 utility helos had by now already picked up the last 2 companies of air assault infantry and flown them and dropped them off to the southwest to capture and hold the I-10 bridge, and were now beginning to return on their first supply run to drop off mortars and ammunition, as they would be coming in about the time that this battle was ongoing. This battle would be very short-lived, as the PLAN Marines would lay down enormous volumes of fire against these personnel as an Su-34 crossed over the area, heading to bomb the U.S. Marines' positions, as this was one of the 2 aircraft that was designated to achieve this. Initially coming in the first hour, late in the first hour, as this battle was going on this map in this area. So this was a 1.5 mile by 1 mile map. In this 1 by 1 mile area, these aircraft initially started by dropping 8,000 pounds of munitions and a spread over the area to pound the dug-in positions of the U.S. Marines, as they had spent much of their time in the area before the invasion had kicked off, preparing their positions of their bivouac site, fortifying their area, and they had dug many series of trenches and foxholes throughout the area, and as they had done so, it would all end up being for naught. Although they would put up the best fight again possible, they would be savagely ripped to pieces by the combination of the PLAN Marines' firepower with their mortars, with their infantry-based weaponry, as well as also, of course, the very powerful gunship support from the Z9WA gunships of their combat aviation company. And the icing on the proverbial cake, so to speak, was the two Su-34 strike aircraft carrying out strikes already within the first hour on these positions. As all of this was underway and the landings in the first hour were occurring, the gunships were lighting up the armed reactionary civilians, even destroying this pickup truck with armed personnel coming out of this garage, being lit up by 23 millimeter fire and blasted as cruise missiles came in and destroyed street bridges throughout the area. And ATGMs were even fired at other vehicle targets. This pair of J-10 fighters was conducting combat air patrols over the area to ensure air superiority, as this was their main priority early on into the invasion, as by now, at this moment, they were primarily armed with air-to-air munitions and only a pair of 1,000-pound laser-guided precision munitions for emergency strikes to support troops on the ground if necessary, although the vast quantities of air-to-ground munitions between all 12 Su-34s combined would be sufficient for a time. It was important to have backup options in this area, so to speak, and thus these aircraft would be on standby in absolute emergencies to support the ground troops with these precision munitions. As the battle against the U.S. Marines, as the PLAN Marines would face off against them, would be rather intense, although somewhat short-lived, as it would in all be a roughly 3-hour battle. The first hour would be securing the landing zone before the platoons would spread out throughout the area with their comprising squads taking positions to guard this entire area to control the bridge crossing, with this platoon taking this area here, this platoon remaining in this area and fanning out, and one platoon being utilized for a reconnaissance and force operation to cross this 1 mile space between this map and where the Marines' bivouac location was. As again, everything was seen through the ISR apparatus and everything processed through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as these gunships would move in closer to support this platoon entering the area of the Marines' bivouac location. This company of air assault infantry Marines of the PLAN would have by now fought off this attack with their standard weapons, although they would lose 3 KIAs in the process and 8 wounded in action, mainly taking hits in the extremities, while the 3 KIAs took mostly headshots. They would be medevaced out during the supply run to drop off mortars, as mortars were dropped off in copious amounts by the Z-18s, as well as crates of ammunition and supplies. They would be removed by these helos back to the Type 75 ship for the WIAs to be treated by the medical personnel aboard and for the KIAs to be effectively dealt with and stored until they could be worked on by the morticians. As this was a very small number of losses between the entire company of 150 troops, these platoons were still highly combat effective, as these losses were very minor overall in scale. And as they had fought this off before the end of the first hour of the time they had landed, the Cleansing of these areas, pacifying them with gunship fire, had enabled the gunships to move forward through this area to support the recon and force of this platoon, as they had already begun to fire ATGMs from their positions as they moved forward to support the advance of this platoon into the area, as ATGMs had already come in and hit this particular section, which was part of the heavy machine gun platoon of the weapons company, as the rifle company consisted of a company headquarters, 3 rifle platoons, and 1 weapons platoon. The weapons company had a company headquarters, a mortar platoon, an anti-tank platoon, and a heavy machine gun platoon. Heavy machine gun platoon was equipped with 50 cals and Mark 19s, which Mark 19s were belt-fed grenade launchers, effectively like a 40 millimeter grenade machine gun. And of course, the 50 caliber M2 was a very powerful anti-materiel machine gun, and they were arrayed in such a way where they could support these trench lines. There was also an anti-tank section in this particular trench shown on the map, which would be struck by HJ-08 ATGMs, as 4 would be fired at this exact trench along with 23 millimeter cannon fire. 23 millimeter fire would also be fired at this trench with mortar strikes, as the mortar company of the Air Assault Battalion will have by this point been well stocked with 82 millimeter mortars, as the American uses a very similar system, an 81 millimeter mortar. Both were effectively equal in their destructive power, and the old school method of gunnery would even cause some casualties among this PLAN platoon of Air Assault Infantry Marines as they moved into the area and spread out along this road. Another cruise missile strike would destroy this bridge to prevent any entry into the urban area of Beaumont from this position. As they moved in and took positions along the road, they were near a farm, as there were 2 barns here, farmhouse, stretches of wooded areas throughout the area. And already in the first hour, again, it has to be understood that this bombing attack had already taken place, destroyed these troops in their trenches, including this Mark 19 section, this rifle section, this one, and this one, as well as the 50 cal section. As, again, both companies, Alpha Company, which was a rifle company, and the weapons company, were interspersed throughout this area to mutually support one another. The headquarters area, which was bermed off and had tents set up and a communications array, was totally bombed by 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, which even blew out the berm that had been placed around it. All these ACVs, or armored combat vehicles, which were the replacement for the older AAVs, or amphibious assault vehicles, which were tracked vehicles. These wheeled vehicles were more modern, and some had the 30 millimeter autocannon equipped, which made these massively powerful vehicles to utilize in combat against attacking forces. However, these vehicles were a high priority to annihilate for this reason, and the PLAN Marine platoon moving across the street in this area, across the road, would be laying down heavy fire with their QBJ-201 light machine guns, their QBZ-95 rifles, with some riflemen having the 35 millimeter grenade tubes to fire 35 millimeter grenades, also Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, mostly anti-personnel rounds, although there were few anti-armor rounds carried, and a small number of HJ-08 man portable ATGMs, as they carried their weaponry that they could on their person across this long field separating both maps and into this area. As each squad had 1 HJ-08, they would utilize these sparingly, as they carried slightly more Type 90 or Type 69 RPG systems with rockets. They had a sizable option for firepower in order to suppress these U.S. Marine forces, as there were 2 rifle sections or squads holed up in these wooded areas as they had moved forward into this area to effectively conduct patrols and use these as OPs, or observation points, to observe the area. They effectively, for a short time, had survived because they were out of the path of the massive Su-34 strikes that occurred to the north of their position, as, again, the Marines were well spread out and well dug in, and the Su-34 strikes took several passes to completely wipe out most of the positions as the trench lines continued in the area between this and this map, and there were tents and vehicles spread throughout the area as well. Everything from supply trucks like LMTVs, there were fuel trucks like so, there's a recovery vehicle, there were ACVs, trucks, MRAPs, and all of these would be destroyed as this area with the different campsites set up and vehicles set up would have been destroyed before this action would take place against the mortars, as the mortars would begin to conduct a small number of strikes against the PLAN Marines as they had showed up and spread out. The forward observers, upon having had seen them move into this area during the second hour, will have by then ran across the entire bivouac site to inform the FTC personnel at the platoon headquarters about the rough coordinates of these personnel to begin to fire mortars and effectively walk them in to hit targets. As again, they had to do gunnery the old school way. They had lost their ISR capabilities, communications, and modern technology, and now would have to do everything with maps and calculations with coordinates and the calculations of the positioning of the mortar tubes themselves. As they would open fire into this area, immediately the ISR surveillance apparatus, noticing this, as earlier these mortar pits had been covered with netting with their IR signatures camouflaged by the combination of the troops being inside the bunkers where mortars were stored as at the time, as well as having in the netting juniper branches and other pines concealing their IR signature, one of the few ways to not immediately be noticed by the coalition's gargantuan surveillance apparatus. Upon having moved these to fire, they were noticed immediately, and cruise missiles were fired from the vessels at sea as the supersonic YJ-18Bs were fired from the Yuan-class submarines off the coast at these targets because they were now priority targets, as these were the heaviest weapons available for use by the Marines in this area, and they were to be destroyed. As this platoon was conducting real-time surveillance with their quadcopter assets combined with the orbiting WZ-7 high-altitude reconnaissance capabilities over the area, pinpointing additional targets that already hadn't been destroyed by the massive airstrikes over this massive area. The mortar fire, some would cause a few KIAs and WIAs as they would impact this squad and this squad on the end. Two would miss entirely and land harmlessly in this field. But the counter fire against the Marines from the PLAN's own mortars would be absolutely devastating, as they were all ISR and AI, real-time AI battlefield data processing system directed, and destroyed all the troops in these wooded areas, including also with the gunship fires, 23mm fire splashed in these areas, as well as also 23mm fire and 4 HJO-8 ATGMs destroying this anti-tank squad like so, right as they were trying to get off one of their Javelin ATGMs firing towards this general direction, although it would splash behind the squad and not cause any fatalities, no KIAs or WIAs. It was a reasonable attempt at trying to hold these PLA forces back the best that they could, although with the gunship support and the mortar support and the airstrikes, this was effectively impossible, although two rifle squads from nearby trenches would try to launch a counterattack and close with this PLA platoon across the road to try to effectively wipe them out, close with and destroy the enemy, as the Marines say. They would fail in this endeavor as well, as little by little, as they ran as fast as possible before beginning to bound and cover after having had split up and spacing their troops out, would gradually be picked off by gunship 23mm fire and eventual mortar strikes as they got closer to the PLA squads, who also were laying down heavy volumes of small arms fire against them, including 35mm grenades with that, as well as rocket-propelled grenade fire into these forces at the same time as the gunships fired 23mm fire into the area, and 82mm mortar strikes came in and finished off these two squads. The fighting was very intense, as again, even opening up the fighting as this platoon came in. Heavy exchanges of fire between this squad, and this squad against these personnel in these wooded areas with mutually supporting fields of fire as they took their positions in line formations along the road. They could all mutually support one another, firing at these different areas as the two half squad elements of each squad, so there are 5 men each in the half squads. One half squad could lay down fire here, while the other could lay down fire here, or the whole squad could lay down fire, shifting fire at this wood line, and vice versa. And all the squads could effectively do that the same way, according to the real-time AI battlefield data systems guidance on the situation, as the ISR surveillance apparatus was monitoring the whole area in real time and effectively mapping out the area in real time, including the positions of American personnel in real time. And they were removed in real time as they were destroyed and wiped out. The same would be the case with PLA personnel. If a whole PLA squad was wiped out, it would also be removed from the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. But this did not happen, as only a small number of PLA troops were KIAs and WIAs from the mortar strikes and some of the return fire received from these different squads. As between this entire platoon, all 5 of its squads, there would only be 4 KIAs and there would be 7 WIAs, with only 2 being critical, and those would be from the mortar strikes. Although this ACV had come in trying to fire its 30mm autocannon, it would overshoot the PLAN Marines who were in the prone position across the street, laying down behind the elevated road and laying down fire. The 30mm autocannon fire just barely missing them overhead, as they would have assistance from mortar fire and also 23mm fire, which would wipe out all the personnel in this trench and the vehicle as well, with the mortar strikes coming in as well. All of this heavy firepower was simply too much for the U.S. Marines to withstand, and the Marine forces, although relatively well armed, were thrown back into the Stone Age at the loss of all communications capabilities, ISR capabilities, and thus having no actionable intel, had to rely on personnel to effectively transmit messages, or like the forward observers who made it back with their lives just barely to their mortar platoon's headquarters and FDC element, would have to rely on personnel like these to gain rough coordinates of enemy forces, which was subject to change, as it was possible that these PLA forces could have continued moving, although they stayed in their spot, because they had effectively run into resistance and would have to effectively remove that resistance, and they had heavy gunship support with ATGM 23mm fire and mortar strikes throughout this area that completely wiped these forces out, including these personnel trying to counterattack from other trench systems. And the airstrikes had been ongoing throughout this time, as the initial airstrikes towards the end of the first hour had smashed all of this, including the headquarters area that had been set up, and continued on smashing areas in the middle, and then this area, and then finally they had dropped the last 6,000 pounds aboard each of these aircraft onto the mortar pits and trench systems below, as YJ-18 Bs were coming in to annihilate these mortar pits along with the airstrikes, as the last 6,000 pounds splashed through this area in each of these 2 mortar pits and trench systems, along with the cruise missile strikes. All that was left was the headquarters element of the platoon, to which was FDC, some forward observers, and the lead NCO and officers to flee into the woods, as this area had been effectively established along a wood line of a forest, and in the forest itself had been trenches behind the emplacement of the mortar platoon to defend them from rear attack, while tents had been spread throughout this area for the company's personnel as well as their vehicles, which had all been destroyed already by the time this action was taking place, which is why these shells or hulks of smoking, burning vehicles are shown here in these areas where tents and other facilities had been established and now were completely destroyed at the time of these strikes with the missiles and the aircraft. A small number of Marines would escape out of this area with their lives to fight another day, and they would only make it to the second day as they fled this battle space, with others having it fled to the general north, and then turning to the slight west to continue through forests. They would eventually, upon having had fled this area, rendezvous with 500 armed reactionary civilians who were to the general north and west of this area, and try to come up with a plan to effectively counterattack the invaders. Although these militia type armed civilians and remaining Marines, which numbered approximately 50 total, would absolutely fail because they would be hunted down on day 2 by elements of the air assault battalion, as they would be seen in the forest moving with the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through the ISR apparatus, and an attack plan would effectively be prepared to attack these forces. And other clearance activities would continue, with the air assault battalion attacking other elements of armed civilian militia-type forces, or just bands of ordinary armed civilians that were to the general north of the battle space. For the first day, the primary objectives would be the clearance and seizure of the key node of the city of Beaumont, the control of I-10, the control of the Sabine Entergy power plant, and control of Orange as the gateway into the southeast, literally, and again, all segments of I-10 and the port facilities in Beaumont for the massive logistical capabilities they enshrined, as well as also controlling the Port of Arthur and the airports. All of this was effectively the main objectives for the first day of the PLAN, as their forces would fight over all these objectives and would have massive fire support from the sea, from the air, and even the strategic missile forces initially firing 8 total tactical ballistic missiles on day 1, as all of these forces of the PLAN Marine 6th Brigade were powerful fighting forces, as they were effectively a self-contained fighting force, as they contained many capabilities just within their own brigade. They were a highly effective and quasi-elite fighting force, and were effectively more than capable of overtaking the defending forces that were in this area. Again, a hodgepodge of effectively logistical personnel, small number of combat personnel in the form of the Marines, who were reservists called up from the local area, as well as also a small contingent of American paramilitary alphabet personnel, the DHS personnel guarding the power plant. Again, American forces were spread thin, but the Americans tried to protect everything. As the saying went, he who tries to defend everything defends nothing. And this is because if your forces are spread too thin, they will be easy to annihilate by the concentration of larger or heavier forces who will be attacking. In this case, while the Marines were, again, relatively well armed, the PLAN was as well, and the PLAN was more technologically advanced, as they had AI dominance, they had firepower dominance, IT dominance, ISR dominance, and as a result of the Americans losing all of their ISR and IT and other capabilities, and being a relatively small force, they effectively stood no chance against the PLA in the form of the PLAN Marines. And thus, they were relatively quickly wiped out. Within the first 3 hours, the 2 air assault infantry companies of the PLAN Marines Air Assault Battalion of their 6th Brigade, along with their mortar company, had completely seized control of the Highway 96 bridge crossing, as their forces had effectively now spread out throughout the area to control the entire bridge span over the river and into the city, and could control any and all traffic through the area. Again, they would effectively allow refugee traffic, as they were not out to target non-combatants, although again, they were not all that concerned about collateral damage, but at the same time, they didn't outright target non-combatants. They would allow them to pass as a refugee corridor of sorts, but any armed combatants would be immediately annihilated by these troops as they controlled the actual bridge itself over this area. And sporadically, as the helos, of course, the Combat Aviation Company would have to return to the Type 075 landing dock or amphibious assault ship or helicopter carrier for fuel, rearmament, and any needed maintenance, they would be sporadically patrolling the areas occupied by the ground-based air assault forces of the air assault infantry and, of course, their mortar company in this area, as they would hold their positions to support their now spread out platoons of the two air assault infantry companies in the area. As at the same time as this initial battle was underway, from controlling the landing zone to pushing into the bivouac zone of the U.S. Marine Corps and the strikes that ensued with the very powerful Su-34 aircraft, who, again, not only had AI to guide their munitions to target, but also, even before that, had been equipped with the SVP-24 computerized bomb sights, which made unguided munitions, again, virtually as accurate as laser-guided precision munitions. The mass strikes on this area were a resounding success for the most part, with everything else being mopped up by the PLAN Marines, who were backed up by their attack helicopter gunships and their 82 millimeter mortar company. As by hour 3, the single platoon that conducted the recon in force now conducted a battle damage assessment as they swept through this large area and completed this by the 3rd hour, effectively making it to the now destroyed trench lines and mortar pits. They would then eventually return through the area and all the way back to the LZ to support the rest of their company operating in this area. And at the time, all of this was going on as the opening anti-ship strikes were underway, and even use of air defense weapons as HHQ-9s knocked down the military helicopters patrolling the harbor area, namely the 2 MH-60Rs and the Dolphin helicopter of the Coast Guard. The landings of the reconnaissance battalions comprising companies went relatively smooth as they seized control of the Marine Services facility and its docks, which were absolutely vital to allowing the easy offloading of the medium combined arms battalion and light combined arms battalion, which would take several hours on the north shore of Lake Sabine, while to the southwest in the Port Arthur port, the single company of combat engineers put on rubber rafts with motors to rapidly seize control of the port facilities had done so without firing a shot, allowing for them to bring the rest of their battalion ashore and all their equipment and even their robotics and other assets, as well as the heavy combined arms battalion, to begin their push towards the city of Beaumont, as the follow-up battalions, artillery, SHORAD, or air defense, and support battalions would be landed, as the support battalion would be the chief logistical force of all of these battalions in the area. So the reconnaissance battalion would clear flanks along with the light combined arms battalion, as the medium combined arms battalion would head to Vidor to control this major road junction. The reconnaissance battalion would rapidly move to the Vidor area as well to control the bridge crossing in and out of Beaumont after first having had cleared the flanks. The light combined arms battalion would seize a vital segment of I-10 and the Entergy power plant, which was the literal crossing into the state of Louisiana and into the American Southeast, as the external invasion components, according to fourth-generation warfare doctrines of the invasion prong of Group Armies 15 through 20, minus Group Army 15 being shed off further to the south and west in Houston, would the rest of the 5 would be moving through this area along I-10 and into the southeast to boost the Trojan forces operating in that invasion sector, as the south central invasion sector would be covered by sizable numbers of additional group armies and a Russian combined arms army crossing from south of the border. As the fighting would be relatively short-lived over the Marine Services facility by elements of the Reconnaissance Battalion, this will have occurred again immediately, as the Air Assault Battalion was already en route to drop off their first companies in the north by the 96 Bridge. The battle for the north shore of the Sabine Lake will be covered in the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series, highlighting fourth generation warfare doctrines, utilizing a Sino-Russian coalition invasion. More to come.